I also asked for a chance, Your Honor. I was 16 when this terrible accident occurred. I didn't commit any crimes. I am not a murderer of any kind.
In a Michigan courtroom this week, 18-year-old Travion Smith denied being a murderer. This was 2 years after a high-speed crash killed a mother and her unborn child, paralyzed her husband, injured their toddler. The jury had convicted him, but the judge's final decision, that was still to come. We are going to break down the ruling that sealed Smith's fate for decades with an expert trial attorney. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. You could hear a pin drop inside of a Macomb County courtroom as 18-year-old Travion Smith rose to speak, his future in the hands of Judge James Biernat. And in a final plea, Smith tried to distance himself from the label of murderer.
I am not a murderer of any kind. The Lord knows my heart, Your Honor. And respectfully, with all due respect, I hope that He helps you to understand it as well.
But minutes later, the judge delivered the words that will define the rest of Smith's life, a prison sentence stretching decades into his adulthood. But to understand how it came to this moment, what we're talking about, we got to go back 2 years. We got to go back to a summer night in Sterling Heights, Michigan. It was August 12th, 2023 at around 9:30 p.m. when, according to testimony from a Sterling Heights police lieutenant, officers spotted a Chevy Equinox driving oddly along 15-mile road. It had its turn signal on, was drifting in and out of its lane, and this immediately raised red flags. That kind of swerving and hesitation often would signal a possible drunk driver. So police, they pulled in behind it to run the plate, and a quick check revealed that the SUV had no insurance, which automatically is a misdemeanor, right? So officers, they moved in for a routine traffic stop. And here is where everything turned. This is where the heartbreak starts. If the driver, then 16-year-old Travion Smith, had just pulled over, none of what you're about to hear would have happened, and a family wouldn't be left to recover from what is essentially an unimaginable nightmare. Because instead of stopping, Smith hit the gas. Investigators say he pushed that vehicle to 93 miles per hour down Van Dyke Avenue and then barreled through a red light at 16 Mile Road. At that intersection, he slammed into another car. Inside were 31-year-old Faith Kanaya, she's also gone by Faith Guma, her husband Norman Guma, and their 2-year-old son. Now, tragically, Faith, who was pregnant, died instantly along with her unborn child. Norman survived but was left paralyzed, no longer able to speak or care for himself, and that little boy was critically injured but thankfully eventually recovered. And somehow, by the way, despite the devastation he left behind, Smith walked away without a single scratch. He was arrested. Court records show he was charged as an adult with second-degree murder, gross negligence causing the death of a fetus, fleeing and eluding police, 2 counts of reckless driving causing serious injuries, and in July of this year, a jury convicted him on all counts. And following the verdict, prosecutor Peter Lucido didn't hold back, saying, "This time, a jury has spoken. Enough is enough." This jury verdict reminds us all that every choice we make carries consequences that go far beyond the moment. This young man's decision to flee from a routine traffic stop has left an overwhelming loss. His actions not only shattered a family, but also eroded the community's sense of security. Our office will always tirelessly pursue justice for the families who have to live with these unnecessary, tragic events. Now, according to a release from the Macomb County Prosecutor's Office, the Michigan House is actually reviewing a bill to increase penalties for people who refuse to pull over for police. In that release, Lucido addressed that pending legislation, saying, "Every time someone runs, they roll the dice with innocent lives. I want to end that gamble. We need statutory enhancement of consequences, including mandatory prison time. The people of the state of Michigan deserve to be protected." By the way, I got to call this out. So aside from a murder charge, prosecutors really were trying to make an example of what he did. I mentioned this earlier, that Smith was charged with fleeing and eluding police. Well, under Michigan state law, that is a felony that can be broken up into 4 degrees. Smith was charged with a first-degree felony, meaning his actions led to someone's death, and he would therefore be eligible for up to 15 years in prison. But here's the thing, that maximum prison time, that's not mandatory, which is what the prosecutor was pushing for. That is a point. So with all that in mind, the guilty verdict in this case brought everyone back to court this week on August 26 for sentencing, where the judge would deliver a ruling that would change Travion Smith's life forever. All right, so we're going to get there, but first I want to bring on a special guest to help me break all this down. Former prosecutor, trial attorney, civil litigator, criminal defense attorney, Imran Ansari. Imran, it's so good to see you. I want to actually start with what I just mentioned. You know, it's interesting. It's kind of nebulous what we're talking about in the sense of what this could be. But the idea of a push to increase the penalties, maybe mandatory prison time for people who don't pull over at a routine traffic stop. Do you think that's the right decision? Because again, in a case like this, I don't know if it would have deterred him in any way, but the idea of if he just would have pulled over, none of this would have happened. Do you agree there should be increased penalties for people who don't pull over?
Sure. I mean, it depends on the circumstances, right? That legislation that they're pushing for could be very, very beneficial in certain ways, right? Because it would have a deterrent value for someone who is not going to obey an officer's directive to pull over. But then again, the person who is not pulling over is already in a state of mind that they are going to commit the criminal acts potentially. Now, there may be reasons why someone doesn't pull over that could be legitimate. But Jesse, I would submit that it's probably going to be few times that when someone sees an officer behind them with the lights, or they hear on the microphone saying, you know, pull over to the right, but then they gun that car, they don't have the right intent, right? There's a nefarious reason why they are fleeing from the police, most likely in most cases. So I do see the benefit of this legislation being implemented because it gives law enforcement and prosecutors the ability to prosecute someone who fled the police in a more stringent or strict manner. But then again, from the deterrent value, it may have an effect, but when someone's going to flee the police, they're probably going to do it no matter what.
And going to this case, do you think it was appropriate to charge him and to try him as an adult, given what happened here? And when we're talking incredibly serious charges like second-degree murder, do you think that was the right course of action?
I think it was in this particular case because the prosecutors and of course then the court considering the application to try him as an adult were seeing the circumstances, right? He took off from the police, and it had catastrophic consequences to this family. You know, was there intent? Well, you don't have to have intent with a crime like this. And it essentially wiped out a family. A mother and her unborn child lost their lives. The father is paralyzed and in a horrible state of health. And then you have this young child now who is really going to grow up in a fractured household. So I see why the decision was made. And I do think that if you're going to charge someone as an adult, prosecute them in this way, bring these charges, this is the appropriate case.
Are you surprised he was convicted across the board for this? I struggle to find what you know, a defense would have been, this idea of it being a bad decision but an accident. And I'll play a little bit from what his defense attorney had to say at sentencing. But it doesn't. Were you surprised by this verdict?
I wasn't surprised. And this is one of the cases that, as a defense attorney, you're looking at, and you really have an uphill battle in terms of a defense, because from the outset, Jesse, you're going to have this really shocked reaction from that jury. They're going to be angry. They're going to be looking at the defendant as someone who was very callous and very reckless with their actions and took, you know, the lives and really fractured this family. And it doesn't surprise that he was convicted. It doesn't surprise me that he was charged in this way. And of course, with the defense attorney, you're looking at this case, and if your client wants to go to trial, despite this uphill battle, you're going to do it. But it was a very tough case for the defense.
Let's talk about sentencing. So during the sentencing, Smith actually spoke on his behalf. But instead of, you know, fully accepting responsibility for what happened, he pushed back. But even before we get to that, okay, even before the hearing officially began, Smith was asked kind of a routine but important question. Was he satisfied with his attorney? This is what he had to say.
I said I have asked him to do a few things for me that he haven't did. I don't know what's going on. Like, at first it was good, but now I don't know what's going on. But I've been fighting my case for 2 years, Your Honor. I've been fighting my case since I was 16 years old. we at sentencing now. It's almost the end. I don't want you to feel like I'm trying to prolong nothing. I'm just ready to get everything over with.
Are you satisfied with having Ms. Hardvala be your attorney today at sentencing right now?
Yes, it's the end. It's up to you, Your Honor. Really.
Well, he's your third attorney. You want to proceed with Mr. Hardvala
Yes.
today? Yes. Okay. All right.
Thank you, Judge.
All right.
Okay, so first of all, how significant is it legally when a judge asks a defendant if they are satisfied with their attorney, if they feel good about them representing them during the sentencing hearing? And here you have the defendant basically say, well, he could have filed more motions for me and he really didn't. What is a court supposed to do at this point?
Well, certainly you see this defendant perhaps being savvy enough to set up a challenge to the conviction and then the sentence by, perhaps claiming ineffective assistance of counsel and then also potential appellate issue.
You mean on appeal? Yeah.
Yeah, appellate issues. But even before the appeal, he may get another attorney to make a motion to set aside the verdict and challenge his attorney's representation, at the outset. And certainly then on a full-fledged appeal of the case, that would be one of the appellate issues that he may want to raise. So he is clearly, potentially setting a record at this point that he may not have been entirely satisfied with the representation, and that could be issues on appeal and motions post-trial.
Should the court have stopped this sentencing from moving forward? I believe they said this was his third attorney, or does the court just say, listen, I hear what you're saying, but you're telling me to move forward nonetheless, or you're saying, it is what it is at this point. I don't really know what the court was supposed to do other than continue forward with the hearing.
Yeah, and Jesse, you make a great point about this being, he had multiple attorneys, this being perhaps his third attorney in the case. At some point, the judge is going to have to just stop that with a defendant. And if there's now a rendered conviction, a verdict from that jury, and now it's on the sentencing phase, it's not always about the defendant, right? You have to have justice and closure for this family. And I think that's what the judge is thinking here. They're like, all right, you may be raise it on appeal. We're going forward with the sentencing. And there's certainly a pattern here with this defendant, and the patience of the court may have just been done at that point.
Now, this sentencing hearing, it began with heartbreaking victim impact statements that were read aloud by the prosecutor, and it captures the depth of this loss, the ripple effect that this crash had on Faith and Norman's family. Friends describe Faith as a light in their lives, a devoted wife and mother whose life and the life of her unborn child were just stolen in an instant. Norman's injuries, leaving him unable to move or speak, they were described as a fate worse than death. Their toddler son lost the full presence of his parents in his life. And after those impact statements, Smith's attorney rose, and he tried to make whatever plea he could for mercy. He painted a very different picture.
It was an accident. It was not a planned killing. I've seen cases which are much, much more horrible than this on a murder too. Travion is a 16-year-old law-abiding kid. He has no prior record whatsoever, not even traffic tickets. Travion never bore any malice to the Kinaya family or to anyone else.
But the prosecutor quickly pushed back on the defense's argument, didn't mince words, highlighted that Smith's statements, attempts to protect his own rights, didn't change the fact that he had shattered a family.
Your conduct killed a woman and her unborn child. You are a murderer. Your Honor, the defendant wants you to protect his rights. He can't even make it through a statement to the family. He can't even express his condolences without immediately turning it to himself. This is somebody who we don't have to worry about in the future.
And finally, it was Smith's turn to speak to the court. And as he offered what could be taken as a partial apology before shifting the focus onto himself.
First, I would like to send my deepest condolences to the Kanaya family. And I wish Faith Kanaya rest in love and peace. I have requested from my lawyer, my attorney, to file a motion to preserve my rights, and I respectfully request that this be my bad, Your Honor. I'm kind of nervous. I didn't commit any crimes, so I couldn't understand why this happened to me. I truly don't even understand why they followed me in the first place, Your Honor. I am not a murderer of any kind.
And he went on to request the judge disregard the verdict, maybe grant him a retrial. Well, what happened? The judge in this case, James Biernat, delivered the sentence, 25 to 40 years in prison. Imran, going to you. You think that's the appropriate sentence here? How long do you think he's going to serve? It doesn't seem like anything he could have said or what his defense attorney could have said would have really changed this in any way. I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I agree, Jesse. You know, the defense had to, if there are going to come following those victim impact statements, which is a very hard thing to do for a defense attorney when you have such an emotionally charged case like this with such a tragic loss of life. In a case like this, you're going to have to try to argue that it was an accident, right? But this is an accident that is out of the negligence range, which the prosecutors actually looked at. The jury looked at this case and agreed that this is well beyond just an accident, and this was a criminal act. But the defense had little to work with here. And then you had the defendant, right, who really wasn't offering much of a sympathy for the family, wasn't really offering much to indicate that he had remorse for his actions. And that's going to factor in when the judge ultimately is going to be making that decision on the sentencing here. And that's what we see here. I actually want to look back at the mugshot of this defendant. And if you look at the mugshot of this defendant, even at that time, fresh, in time to this horrific tragedy, he sort of has this smirk. And I think that's sort of carried through the trial, through the prosecution, and ultimately to the way he addressed the court. So I'm not surprised that he got this time. And I think he's going to be probably serving his full sentence.
Look, you think about the devastation he left behind, and you talk about whatever mitigating factors there might be. He didn't do himself any favors, and there's only so much that a defense attorney can control their client's statement, right? You could have a client who said, what do you advise I say? Should I say anything? But at the end of the day, it's up to the defendant to say whatever they want to say, that the judge will allow.
Absolutely, and that's why, you have to know your client. And if it seems that they're going to do a disservice to themselves at the sentencing phase, you may want to caution them and counsel them to allow you to speak on their behalf. But ultimately, again, it's their decision if they want to address the court. You can't stifle that. And you just hope that they're going to be addressing the court and the victims' families and showing some remorse for their actions after a conviction. Certainly, though, if there is, I'm taking it away from this case, but in a scenario where you are going to appeal the conviction and maintain your client's innocence, you're going to have, him or her address the court in a certain way or not at all. But in this case, you are hoping that the defendant is going to rise and look to the jury, look to the judge, look to the family, and indicate that they are somewhat remorseful for their actions.
Let's talk about that, because for Faith's family, this hearing, this sentence, this ruling marked the end of a long trial, but it's not the end of their grief. On the GoFundMe page that was set up after the crash, a family member shared just how devastating that night was. Part of it reads, "It's an absolute tragedy and nightmare of a situation. But my best friend and first cousin Norman was driving home from a night out with his pregnant wife Faith and their 2-year-old son on Saturday, August 12, 2023, when their car was struck on the passenger side by another vehicle going 85 miles per hour, fleeing from the cops for driving without insurance. The toddler suffered fractured ribs and lacerated organs, but is expected to make a full recovery, thank God. Norman, on the other hand, was rushed to the hospital." And at the time that was posted, Norman was in critical condition, fighting for his life. But as of the last update from August of 2024, he was released in therapy, has unfortunately not made very much progress physically. That GoFundMe has since raised almost $300,000 with nearly 300,000 donations, and we will continue to keep this family in our thoughts and in our prayers as they try to navigate through this terrible nightmare. Imran Ansari, thank you so much for taking the time. It was good seeing you.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
And that is all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.